It's very common to study the topic women in the New Testament or women in the Gospels, but that forgets that the New Testament is a very badly defined collection of books, and the Gospels, there are four of them and they're very different. So we want to focus in more precisely and look at women in a text we can reconstruct out of Matthew and Luke, women in Q. Now, I happen to know, Sarah, you are actually an expert on women in Q.
Isn't that convenient?
Yes, it is. Yes, that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah. Well, Tom, I just had the thought a few years back that we do study women in the New Testament, Jesus and women, Jesus and Paul, Jesus in the New Testament, women in the New Testament, women in the Gospels. But what if we could go back earlier? Because the Gospels, although we need to use them as our evidence for the historical Jesus, if we're on that quest, they're decades later. In the case of John, maybe not until the year 90, 100, maybe 110, some people think. So what if there were a way to get back to some of the earliest Jesus material? And in my opinion, some of that material is what we call Q, which is the sayings collection that was used by the authors Matthew and Luke for their quotations of Jesus. And so people said to me, well, that's kind of silly, Sarah, because those sayings are all in the Gospels. So what's the difference? What's the difference if you take them out and look at them or just read them in Matthew and Luke? Well, the difference is context. So I just had to read through Q several times on its own. We have a hypothetical reconstruction, a critical edition published in the Hermeneia series, or lots of people have done their own translations of it. We don't know Q's boundaries, but we have a minimal, very certain, the double material that's in both Matthew and Luke. What do those sayings, what kind of Jesus emerges when you look at just those teachings without the heavy theological messages that are the plan and aim of the gospel writers? And what happens is, what rises out is that Jesus had a rhetoric of gender. There is no question that Jesus deliberately addressed material to women. Now, is it the chicken or the egg? Were there a lot of women following him, and so as a good teacher, he tailored the material to them? Or did he have a mandate of speaking to both genders, and did he attract them through this material? We'll never know. But Jesus spoke in what Jeremias called the Doppelgleichnisse, the double sayings. Jesus had a habit of speaking the same teaching, like a little parable or story, twice.
Okay.
Once with a male protagonist and once with a female protagonist. And of course you see this in the Gospels, but Q is short, and this happens frequently in Q, and it makes you wonder, what was it about Jesus that was attracting women?
Could you give me an example of one of these double stories?
Oh, sure. So the woman who loses a coin, and she sweeps all through the house, and she finds it and she rejoices. The shepherd who loses a sheep, and he has 100 sheep, he loses one. The woman has 10 coins, she loses one. They go and search and they find it and they rejoice. This is like a little double story that Jesus would have told, and he does this over and over. For another example that kind of harks back to the Hebrew Bible, there's a saying that goes something like, at the time of judgment, the Ninevites will look at this generation and condemn it because they listened to the message of Jonah, but someone greater than Jonah is here. And then the female parallel is the queen of the south at the day of judgment will look at this generation and condemn it, for she listened to Solomon, but look, something greater than Solomon is here. It's almost verbatim, except for the variable of gender, the men of Nineveh and the queen of the south.
And as you say, that was an idea that was first put forward by Joachim Jeremias.
Yeah.
But I think you're actually taking Jeremias' argument and moving it further ahead, because Jeremias was just noting it as a phenomenon of duplications in text. You were actually saying that this is symptomatic of actually Jesus had a gendered rhetoric.
It's quite obvious to me that he did do something with gender. And what's interesting is that this is rare in antiquity. It's rare that someone addresses women, but when they do address women, it is not with an identical message. I mean, even Paul says, or wives, obey your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. That's not the same message. Or Ovid writes a couple of poems. One is to men and one is to women. His poem to men is how to catch a woman. The poem to women is how to please a man. So as far as I know, only Jesus delivered an identical kind of intellectual and spiritual message to his male and female recipients, valuing them equally and expecting them equally to be able to respond.
Gosh, you're saying an awful lot there. As I hear it, first of all, you're saying it's not enough to just to read the Gospels. It's very valuable to try and get behind them. We have to realize that they are several generations later. Secondly, when we get behind them, we have to read them with great care, even a short document like Q, a short text like Q. And then we have to read them with a sensitivity to the way the story is told. And so Q actually allows us not only to hear that story, but to hear the story that Matthew tells and the story that Luke tells, to hear it more clearly. But then, as it were, if you go through all that careful scholarly, and it's careful work and there's a certain amount of scholarly pain there, there is a payoff. You suddenly discover something new about the way Jesus taught.
Yeah, that's right.
Sarah, that's wonderful.
I think so.
Thank you.
Thank you.